Today's daf is daf nun tes. Ana have bivinyana debei Rebbe. Rav says that when they took a vote in the Bezdin of Rebbe, uminai didi monerate beresha, I was part of the vote. I was a member of the Bezdin, and they took a vote to be metaken that after the karka remained in the hands of the Sikrikon for a period of 12 months, then anyone could purchase the field from the Sikrikon, and the original Bailim have no right to reclaim that karka. And I was the first one to express my opinion amongst the Dayanim. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, Rav was really the youngest of the whole group. Anantanan, we have a Mishnah Sanhedrin Lamed Beis that dine momenos vehataros vatumos maschilim min agadol. That when Bezdin are dealing with issues of monetary law or tumah v'tar purity, then we begin with the dayan agadol tchila. We don't begin with the youngest. But only with regard to a capital case, then we begin with the youngest of the dayan, the mikatne hadayan. We don't want to ask the dayan agadol first because he might come to the conclusion that the nidon is chayav, and then the ketanim will be afraid they'll be inhibited to contradict him. And the Torah says, "V'itzilu ha'eda," we have to find a way of perhaps exonerating the accused. But in any event, it's clear from the Mishnah that in Dinim Momoros, we begin with the Dayan HaGadol. So why, when they were misaking the Takon of Sikrikin, they began with Ra? He wasn't the Gadol Sheba Dayanim. Adarabba, Rebbe was the Gadol Sheba Dayanim. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rabba, Berei de Rav, Vitema, Rabbi Hill, Berei de Rav Volis, Shani Minyana Debe Rebbe. The case of counting the vote in amongst the Dayanim in the Bezdin of Rebbe is different because the Kule Minyonayu Minatzad Havu Maschilin. In all their judgments in the Bezdin of Rebbe, they always consistently began with the youngest of the judges, even with regard to Dini Momenos. And that's why they began with Rav, and Rav expressed his opinion first. Now the question is, why in the Bezdin of Rav do they have this minhag to always, consistently, without exception, begin with the youngest? So that has to do with a Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Vav Amid Beis. The Gemara there says, "Minayin l'talmid hayoshev fnei Rabo v'roz chus li'ani v'chovel liyoshev minayin shelo yishtok." The Gemara darshans from a pasuk that we always listen to the das katne hadayonim first, and that's called maschilim min atzad, and it's derived from the pasuk losana al riv. The word riv is written in the Torah without a yud, reish beis. And we read it Losana al Rav, meaning we shouldn't be cholik on the Rav. The Rav is the mufla shebet bezdin. Therefore, we start minat stadim minat katan. And the Gemara establishes that Rebbe took this pasuk Losana al Rav, and he applied it even to Dini Momenos. So whereas the other Tanoim, the other Chachamim assumed that Losana al Rav, which tells you to start from the cut, does not apply to Dini Momenos, Rav applied it to Dini Momenos. We go on in the Gemara. Omar Rabba bereit the Rava ve'itema Rabbi Hillel bereit the Ravolis v'mos Moshe v'ad Rebbe lo matzinu Torah gedula b'mokom echad. Moshe Rabbeinu, because the psulei aluchos were his, he became very wealthy. He sold it for a very high price on eBay, and he was also the Gadol Adar. He was the Torah scholar of the generation. So he combined in a very unique integration both Torah and Gedula. And such a combination didn't exist from the time of Moshe Rabbeinu up until Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. So the Gemara immediately attacks this. V'lova ha'hav Yoshua. Now I'm not sure how the Gemara knows that Yoshua has the profile of Gedula. I understand that he was the Gadol b'Torah, but why is he called the Gadol shebegedula? And apparently, since he was the Manhigam Shel Bnei Yisrael after the death of Moshe Rabbeinu, as it says in Dvarim Lamed Daled, V'Yoshua benun mole ruach chachma ki samach Moshe's yadav olav v'yishmu elo bnei Yisrael v'yasu kasher tziva Hashem es Moshe. So he was certainly the Gadol b'Torah of that generation. And I think the word Gedula here in this context might not necessarily mean ashirus, wealth. The Gemara doesn't seem to invoke any proof that Yoshua was wealthy. However, with regard to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, the Gemara establishes in Sanhedrin that he was the Gadol b'Doro b'Torah uba Ashirus. So we see that the Gemara is talking about Ashirus here. I don't know if you have anything in your commentaries here about whether Yoshua was wealthy or not. And I'm going to ask that question over and over again throughout this entire sugya, not just with regard to Yoshua. For example, the Gemara says, Havel Lazar, Yoshua is not counted here in Rabbah's statement because Elazar was a Gadol b'Torah on the same level as Yoshua. And there's a long discussion here about that. It says in Avos at the beginning, Moshe Kibel Torah Misina Mesar Yoshua. It doesn't mention Elazar. And apparently Yoshua received the Torah from Moshe Rabbeinu as a tafkid, as a responsibility to transmit the Torah to Klal Yisrael. But Elazar, even though he was greater than Yoshua in Torah, and this is based on the Gemara Eruvin, nevertheless, he was not appointed with the task of transmitting the Torah to future generations. So the Gemara immediately asks for Havi Elazar. So it means after Yoshua ben Nun died, Elazar was the Gadol b'Doro, b'Gdula, b'Torah. And the Gemara answers, Havi Pinchas. Pinchas was on the same level as Elazar. So the Gemara asks for Hava Pinchas, Hava's Canaan. After the death of Elazar, Pinchas was the Gadol b'Dar. The Gemara answers Hava's Canaan, but there were others Canaan in that Dar that were equal in level to Pinchas. Gemara says, well, what about Shaul? Havai Shaul? Shaul was the Melech, and he was the Gadol b'Yisrael b'Torah, as the Gemara establishes in Eruvin Nun Gimel. Although we have to admit that Shaul did not transmit the Torah, but he was the Gadol Adar b'Torah. Gemara answers Havi Shmuel. Okay, Shmuel was as great, if not greater than Shaul b'Torah, but Hanoch Nafshe, Shmuel died, and after his Ptira, Shaul was the Gadol Adar. So Shaul should be listed on this Mishnah, on this statement of Rabbah. And the Gemara says, Kulu Shonei Kamina. What Rabbah had in mind was those who, for their entire lifetime, their entire lifespan, they were in that level of Gedula, the greatest in their generation, Gedula Utorah b'makom echad, like Moshe Rabbeinu and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. But Shaul would not be a good example because although he did have a certain period of time of gadlus, and that would be after Shmuel's death, but during Shmuel's lifetime, he didn't achieve that crown, that greatness of being the Gadol Mikol Doro. It was Shmuel at that time. Gemara Esvavi David, and the Gemara Havi Ira Hayeiri. Ira Hayeiri was David's Rebbe, and he was the Gadol Hadar B'Torah. Therefore, David could not be mentioned, even though he has Gedula. Gemara Esvav Noch Nafshe, but what about in the period of time in which David lived, and it was after Ira had already died? David at that point is the Gadol Hadar B'Torah B'Gedula, and the Gemara says Kuli Shadi Be'in. Again, the same answer. Havi Shlomo, and the Gemara answers Havi Shimi Ben Gera. He was Gadol B'Torah. So Shlomo was not the exclusive Gadol. V'Katle, Shlomo Melech commanded that Shimi Ben Gera should be put to death, and after his death, Shlomo was certainly the Gadol B'Torah. And again, the Gemara gives the same answer. Kulu Shadi Kamrina. Havi Chizkiah, he was the king in Judah, and he was Gadol Mikol Yisrael B'Doro. And the Gemara answers Havi Shivna. Shivna was even greater than him in Torah. Gemara says Vayiktal. Shivna was put to death by Sancheriv. The Gemara says again the same answer. Kulu Shani Kamrina. Havi Ezra, Havi Nechemi ben Chachalia, who was greater than Ezra in Torah. Now the Gemara continues. Amar Rav Acha Breiderova, Afani Omer Mimos Rebbe Vi'ad Rav Ashi Lo Matzinu Torah Gedula B'Makom Echad. So we have the period of time from Moshe Rabbeinu up until Yoshua, and that was covered by Rabbah's statement. But now we have another statement by Rav Acha to cover the period of time post Rebbe. After Rebbe, up until the end of the period of the Amoraim, which is concluded with Rav Ashi, we don't have Torah Gedula B'Makom Echad. So Gemara says, V'lo v'havi Huna bar Nasan. So the Gemara in Tzvachim Adaf Yutes tells us about Huna bar Nasan, that he stood under the in the presence of the queen, and Hoya Melech Meirim es Chaguraso v'Yamal Kach Rav Ashi she's kind of pasuk v'Hoya Malachim Umnayich. In other words, it indicates that Huna bar Nasan was Gadol b'Chashivuso, and therefore the Gemara thinks that since he was a contemporary of Rav Ashi, therefore Rav Ashi is not the only one that can claim Torah Gdula b'Makom Echad. Gemara answers Shani Huna bar Nasan de Mechaf Avikayef le Rav Ashi. Despite his greatness in Torah, Huna bar Nasan accepted the authority and subjugated himself to the greatness and the leadership of Rav Ashi, and therefore Rav Ashi is considered the Yachid in his Dar b'Torah u'b'Gedula. This leads us to the Mishnah, which is the subject of today's daf, the main subject. Now we have a principle that Cheres Shota v'Katan Lapane Deyaninu, and therefore they cannot effectuate a valid mekach. They can't sell, they can't buy, and yet the Mishnah established a takana, and that takana is mishum darkei shalom, that we should recognize and validate the kinyanim of a cheresh and a katan. We'll see exactly what age the katan is. Cheresh, says the Mishnah, who cannot hear and he cannot speak, he's both deaf and mute. Romes, we can understand from his body language that he wants to sell or buy, and that's called romes. Let's say he romes with his yadayim or with his rush. He bows his head in a way that, or shakes his head, yes, I want to sell it, I want to buy it. V'nirmaz, after he gives our remez that he's interested in the sale or the purchase, then we can, now what's the difference between romes and nirmaz? In the case of Romes, it seems to me, if I understand this correctly, the Cheresh took the initiative and told us he wants to sell or buy through Remizas Yadayim or Rosh. Nirmaz means that others took the initiative. They offered him to buy, or they offered to buy something from him, and through his Remiza, he indicates his, what we call his sratzus, his consent and approval. Now, according to the Tanakama, we're about to see the dissenting view of Ben Beseira. We need what's called a remes, either biyado or barosho. Ben Beseira, Mary disagrees. Kofetz v'nikpatz b'metaltol. He could sell movable objects with what's called akimas vasayim. In other words, he moves his lips in such a way that we understand his approval. The Ravid has a different pshat, and he disagrees with Rashi's akimas vasayim, and instead he says it's kfitza, shu kofetz mimakom lamakom. He jumps from one place to the other, indicating that he wants to give mana, mos, and to take the chayfetz. In other words, let's say the chayfetz is here, he jumps from here to here to want to take the chayfetz, or the mos are here, he jumps from here to here. However, the difference between Rashi and the Ravid is very fundamental. Rashi seems to assume that Ben Beseira is expanding the scope of the validity and the efficacy of the kinyan, whether it's Mechira or Nesina, Mechira or Kniya, of the Cheresh. And that means that Ben Beseira says, Lozu bilvad, not only Remiza, but even Kfitza. But the Ravid who learns Kfitza seems to indicate that Ben Beseira rejects Remes. Remes Bialma is not reliable. You need Kfitza. Hapa'utos, which are Ktanim, Mikchan Mekach, Umimkar Memkar, Bimitalton. Now, the Gemara is going to elaborate on the machlokas between the Tanakama and Ben Beseira with regard to the kinyan of a cheresh, al yidei remiza biyado barosh, based on the Gemara in Yevamos Daf Kuf Yud Beis. Cheresh shenosa pikachas upikeach shenosa chereshes im rotza lahotzi yotzi im rotza l'kayim yikayim. So it means that not only do we recognize the marriage of a cheresh, and that's the case of cheresh shenosa, but we also recognize and validate the gerishim of the cheresh. And that's called, in the language of the Gemara in Yevamos, kishem shu kones biremiza, kachu motzi biremiza. So if the cheresh reveals his intention through a remes that he wants to divorce his wife, and he had married her when he was a cheresh, then we could rely on his remiza to validate a gerushin. Now we're about to understand Rav Nachman, who wants to know if in Gittin, Akimas Vasayim of Ben Beseira, that expanded definition that goes beyond Remiza of Ben Beseira, would that apply even to get? Says Rav Nachman, Machlokas memetaltel begittin divrei hakol beremiza. Even Ben Beseira, who expanded the scope of the takana regarding cheresh, that's only with regard to metalton. A cheresh who wants to sell or buy metaltalin, then Ben Beseira says you don't even need remiza. All you need is akimas sfasayim. But with regard to a get, if a cheresh wants to divorce his wife, even Ben Beseira agrees that we cannot rely on the flimsy akiras sfasayim. We need a more profound indication that he wants to get, and therefore we need a remez biyad obarosh, even according to Ben Beseira. So Gemara says pshita. What did Rav Nachman have to tell me? Obviously, in Gittin, it goes without saying that it's unanimous that there's no efficacy to Akimas Vasayim, and how come? B'metalton Tanan. The Mishnah says in the name of Ben Beseira, Kofetz v'nikpatz b'metalton, which means that we're only dealing with metalton. The din of metalton allows for, according to Ben Beseira, kfitza and nikpatz. But in Gittin, certainly it's pashut that Akimas Vasayim, according to Ben Beseira, would not be meaningful. So my answer is Mao de Tema. If not for Rav Nachman, we would have been able to say that when it says in the Mishnah b'metalton, it's not going to exclude Gittin, but rather there was logical room to argue that the din of Ben Beseira applies only in Gittin. Because since a cheresh can effectuate kiddushin, then we apply the principle of kishem that we said before, kishem shu kones b'remiza kachu motzi b'remiza, and maybe we could extend it according to Ben Beseira to Akimas Vasayim. So certainly, since we are lenient with regard to the Kiddushin of the Cheresh, we could equally be lenient with regard to the Gerish. And therefore, the Mishnah had to add the word b'metalton to tell me af b'metalton, not only b'metalton, but even b'metalton. The Akimas Vasayim is effective according to Ben Beseira, and Kal V'chomer certainly begitted. Kamash Malan, that's what Nachman wants to tell us. No, the din of Ben Beseira expanding the scope of the Takon of Cheresh to include Akimas Vasayim was never applicable to Get. Ikar Diamri, we have a second opinion that has a different statement of Rav Nachman. Omer Rav Nachman k'machlokes b'metalton kach machlokes b'gittin, which means that Ben Beseira validates Akimas Vasayim even in a cheresh, even in get. Frek the Gemara v'anan b'metalton t'nan ema af b'metalton. The Mishnah says Pu'utos mekhan mekach u'mimkar mekar b'metalton and vadkama. At what age does the halacha validate the mekach or memkar of a young child? Machvi be Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yitzchak brei. So Rabbi Yehuda points to his son, Rabbi Yitzchak. How old was the son, Rabbi Yitzchak? Kibar shis, kibar shet. Now wait a second. Either Rabbi Yitzchak was 6 or he was 7. What is this 6 or 7? The Gemara is formulating 2 ages for Pu'utos, one for male children and one for female children. The female child will mature earlier by a year, and therefore already at 6, she's Pu'utos. The male child matures at a slower rate, and therefore we have to wait till he's 7. Rav Kahana Amar, no. Kivar Shev, Kvar Timni. For a girl, it's 7. And for a boy, it's 8. Masni. So Tanu, we have a third opinion expressed by a brisa. Kibar Teisha, Kibar Esa. For a young girl, it's 9, and for a young boy, it's 10. Follow pligi. The Gemara says we can reconcile all these different opinions. Why? Because kol chad v'chad lefi churfei. There is no objective standard of pu'utos to recognize the mekach u'memkar. Every single katan has to be examined and determined, is he charif? Charif means, does he understand at a young age what mekach u'memkar is all about? Like, for example, we give him something of value and we see if he throws it into the sea, we know that he has no charifus. And by the way, just on the side, this Gemara reminds me of the famous chiddush of the Chassam Sofer about a guy. When does a guy become a gadol? Because the standard of 12 and 13 bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, is only given halacha Moshe Sinai to Yisrael. So when is a guy considered old enough to be culpable for his actions? And the Chassam Sofer says, "Chad kol chad v'chad lefi churfei." You can have a young non-Jewish child that's very sharp and he's precocious, and another Gentile will not mature until a later age. The Gemara says, why did the Rabbanan establish this takana, validating the kinyan of a cheresh and a katan? So what does Mishum Kidei Chayav mean? So here we have a gigantic machlokas Rishonim. Most Rishonim say that this takana was motivated to allow a cheresh v'katan to support themselves, to live, to have a financial backing. Nobody's going to want to sell them anything or buy anything from them if you don't make a takana that they can sell and that it can buy and validate. And according to most Rishonim, with the exception of Rav Hai Gaon, this halach applies to every single cheresh and katan. Rav Hai Gaon says no. This takana only applies to kidei chayav, to a situation in which the cheresh v'katan will, so to speak, proverbially starve to death if you don't recognize their kinyan and mechira. But if you have, let's say, a wealthy cheresh v'katan that are financially solid, then we don't recognize their mechira or kniya because they don't fit under this kidei chayav principle. The Gemara now brings another statement of Rabbi Abba Bar Yaakov in the name of Rabbi Yochanan based on a pasuk in Malachim Beis Perik Yud Vayomal Asher Al Maha Meltacha Hotzei Levush L'Chol Ovdei Abal. So the Gemara now is going to focus on one word, Meltacha. But let's say a few words about the background of this pasuk. The Ovdei Abal, who tragically worshipped the idolatry of Baal, were getting quite, their population was expanded. They were quite popular. And Yehu, the king of Israel, wanted to put to death the Kohenei Baal. So he tells the people that Achav Oved es Habal mi'at, Yehu Yavdu Harbe. He commands the Kohenei Baal to gather together, and there's someone who's Memuna, who's in charge of the Meltacha. We'll see exactly what that means. And he will bring out garments, very unique garments, for all the Ovdei Baal, so that we now can recognize who they are by their levush. And then he's going to put them to death. My Meltach, Omer Rab Abba, Rab Yochanan, Dover Nimlal v'Nimta. That's big day Pishtan. And this word Meltacha indicates how they manufacture Pishtan. So these were unique garments, and they wrapped around the Ovdei Baal with those garments. Kiyasa Rav Dimi came, Omer Rab Yochanan, he said in the name of Yochanan, Shigerlo, there was a witch, a very wealthy, very rich Jew, whose name was Bunyam ben Nunyam. And he sent to Rebbe Sivni v'chomes salsalo malmach, 4 different species of pishta that were very thin, very good quality. Sivni v'chomes. Their size, when you folded them over, was ke'arguza upalge damguza, like an egos, which is a walnut, and another half a walnut. So even though at the time that Rebbe wore them, and he accepted this gift and he was able to wrap his body around them, they measured very small. And salsal malmamta kipistika upalge de piskita, again like an egos v'chetzi of an eitz alone. My malmola, what does the word malmola mean? Dovra nimal menimtach is again a min pishtan. So you get the impression that although it was possible to fold this garment up, yet it was large enough, folded up into a small pocket, but yet it was large enough to cover the entire body. It's like if you ever saw these ponchos that they put in, a small pouch, and then you open it up and it's very large. The Gemara asks the following question now. Okay, the pa'utos can sell and buy, but what happens if they were cheated and they were overcharged? Ta'usamad kama. What's the shear that the pa'utos could be mevatel the mekach? Rab Yonah, Rab Yuzeira. It's the same identical shear that applies to gedolim, which is called the shir of Ono ad shtus kigadol. So if the mistake was less than a shtus, then the mekach is not batal, he just pays the difference. The seller who cheated them has to make up the difference. However, if the toes was more than a shtus, more than 1/6, then the entire mekach is batal. Boy Abai asked the following question: Matnaso mai. Did this takana, recognizing and validating the kinyan of a cotton, apply even in a case of matan? And the Gemara says that's a machlokas amoraim. Rabbi Yomi Omer ein matnaso matanu, Mar bar Avashi Omer matnaso matan. The Gemara now tells the following: Afchua v'shadrua lekame derav Mordechai. The chachamim, or let's say the students, the scholars in the yeshiva, they changed around the names here of Mar bar Avashi and Rav Yomi. So it comes out that Rav Yomi is validating the matana, Mar bar Avashi disqualifies the matana. Amar lahu. Rav Mordechai says to the Bnei Yeshiva, after they send this whole business to him, Zilu imru lebar Mar. Go and tell the son of Rav Ashi, right? We have Mar bar Avashi. And Mar bar Avashi validated the maton of a kodah. Lav hachi avi uvda. Isn't it true that there was the following story? Ki avakoi Mar chad karya arav chad karya darga. When Rav Ashi stood with 1 foot on the ground and 1 foot on the ladder, as he was on his way up to the Aliyah of the Beis HaMedrash, we asked him on his way up, what's the status of Matana V'Kata? And he responded, Matnaso Matana. So that would support Mar bar Avashi. If you assume Mar bar Avashi like we have it, but if you switch it around, then it becomes a kasha on Mar bar Avashi. Achas matna shchimira. Hard to believe that such a young child is a shchimira, but never. That's v'achas matna spori, v'achas matana meruba, achas matana muetas. We always recognize and validate the matana of pu'utos, and this leads us to the Mishnah on the bottom of Daf Nun Tes Amud Aleph. Elu dvarim sha'amru mipnei darkei shalom. So we now move from the topic of Mekach u'Memka to the topic of Kriyas HaTorah. Imagine if there's a race in which everybody wants to get first prize to get the first aliyah, and we know how much energy is put into dividing up aliyahs. So in order to avoid situations where people are at each other's throats and to guarantee peace, Kohen Korei Rishon. Again, you could still have a fight between different Kohanim, but at least we cut down our chances. Achrov, second is Levi, Achrov Yisrael. And the third aliyah will be given to Yisrael. Again, there's going to be a battle amongst them. All the Jews in the Kehillah, who's going to get the Shlishi. But all this is Mipnei Darkei Shalom, to avoid Riv. Now, to go on in the Mishnah, we have to introduce the concept of Eruv Chatzeros. You have a large chatzer, a courtyard. There are many houses that have people living in them that spill into this common courtyard. Min Torah, the courtyard, since it's completely mukaf, it's surrounded and it has 4, mechitzos, therefore it's Rishus HaYachid, and you'd be allowed to carry within that chatzer. Shlomo Melech and his Bezdin made a takana that you're not allowed to. It's too similar to Rishus HaRabim. It's so public. You're not allowed to carry from one place to the other unless all the neighbors got together with an Eruv Chatzeros. And they take food from one of the Shchenim and they leave it in one of the houses. And that food is owned by all the Shchenim together. And it's as if they're all Me'uravim Zeh im Zeh. So that all these Batim are considered one Rishus. And the Mishnah says, Ma'arvim b'bayis yashon, mipnei darkei shalom. If there was a regilus that time after time they left the pas in so-and-so's house, that becomes a bayis yashon, and we're not going to change that because otherwise there might be a riv mipnei darkish.